Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Kathy Hanneback. Hello and welcome to episode 11 of the Imagine Otherwise podcast. Today I'm talking with Micha Cárdenas, who's an artist/theorist who creates and studies trans of color movement in digital media, where movement includes migration, performance, and mobility. Micha is an assistant professor of interdisciplinary arts and sciences at the University of Washington, Bothell. Micha completed her PhD in media arts and practice in the School of Cinematic Arts at the University of Southern California. She's also a member of the artist collective Electronic Disturbance Theater 2.0, and her solo and collaborative artworks have been presented in museums, galleries, and biennials, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions, the Centro Cultural de Tijuana, the 01 Biennial, and the California Biennial. Micha was also the recipient of the first ever James Tiptree Jr. Fellowship. Today, Micha is here to talk about using digital media and technology in the service of social justice, how art can enable survival, and how queer and trans communities of color are imagining and creating more just worlds. So thanks so much for being with us, Micha.
Thank you for inviting me, Kathy.
So your work is a fantastic example of what this podcast, the Imagine Otherwise podcast, highlights, this combination of art, of activism, and academia in the service of social justice. So I am very excited that you're here, and I'm very excited to talk with you about some of your current projects as well as some of the past work that you've done bringing these three realms together. So let's start with the present. So I know you're working on a new project called Unstoppable, creating low to no cost bulletproof clothing. Can you tell us a little bit about that project and what it's designed to do?
Yeah, absolutely. The project started last summer in 2015. I had been working for a few years on an earlier project of making safety devices as art. And that project was called Local Autonomy Networks, and it was using wearable electronic technologies. And after a few years of working on it, I started to feel like, I did workshops with the prototypes I made, and I got a lot of feedback from communities that was like, this is cool, but it's too expensive for it to be practical. And I'm still planning on working on grants for that previous project and, trying to come up with a solution for that expense. But in the, after hearing about that wearable electronics approach being too expensive, I was at the Allied Media Conference this past summer, and I was talking to Patrice Cullors about collaborating. She said she wanted to collaborate, and she was wearing this t-shirt that said Bulletproof on it. And she was just releasing this line of clothes with Damon Turner and Foremost called Bulletproof. And I just thought, well, I could use my DIY methods and try to make that line of clothing actually bulletproof. And she said that sounded great. So I started researching affordable bulletproof materials. It looks like it's going to be a long project. My last project was like 4 years, and I expect this project will be long also, because I've been working on it since last summer, and I don't have any really conclusive, immediate results, but I have, some findings, and I'm definitely still researching it.
That's awesome.
So should I say more about detail about what? About Unstoppable? Sorry, that was vague, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, tell us more. So kind of...
so that was the background, right?
Yes.
So
continue.
So then I started researching DIY bulletproof materials. And disturbingly, I found that there are many, many websites on the internet, mostly white supremacist websites and survivalist websites, that have a lot of details about what kind of materials stop what caliber of bullets, and how you can make your own DIY bulletproof armor.
That's intense.
Yeah, it was intense, but I see it as part of my job as a non-black ally to black people and black trans women, that I can take on some of that violence and really dig into those white supremacist websites in a way that affects me differently than it affects them. And so I discovered, like, the first two things that I discovered were that you could stop tires with bullets, stop bullets with tires, sorry, because tires have steel belting in them. And so with enough layers of tire, you can actually stop a bullet. The other thing I found in those websites was that you can get Kevlar, which is a bulletproof fabric, when layered enough. You can get it very cheaply at junkyards because it's used in airbags. And so the immediate part of the project is to mostly just be researching this information and distributing it to people so that people can use it as they will and hopefully have their own cheap, accessible ways of making bulletproof things. So we did a round of testing last summer, which meant I took a bunch of tires and Kevlar that I got from a junkyard, and I went to the desert with Chris Head because he is an artist who's done a lot of work with guns. And we shot some tires and some Kevlar, and we found that with enough layers of tire, we could stop a 9mm pistol, a bullet from a 9mm pistol. We tested that because that is the kind of gun that was used to kill Trayvon Martin. And unfortunately, in our testing, it took like 8 layers of tire to stop a 9mm bullet, and that's not very practical for making a dress per se, but it is possible that you could cut up a tire into 8 layers and put it in a backpack, which would be a heavy backpack, so probably to be worn by an adult, and would make at least you less likely to be shot in the back or to die from being shot in the back. And that brings the issue not just to, I was really inspired by Black Lives Matter and Patrisse Cullors' work, and Patrisse Cullors' idea on asking me what would technology for Black lives be really got me started on this project. But also thinking about people shot in the back. It's very common that migrant people crossing the border get shot in the back by the Border Patrol. So I think there's a lot of people around the world that are subject to gun violence. And I just hope to make more widespread and more accessible bulletproof clothing and bulletproof accessories. So we also tested Kevlar, but the Kevlar that we tested didn't stop anything, and I don't know if that's because we didn't have enough. We only had 2 sheets of Kevlar. We folded it so it made 8 layers, but I think we might actually need 8 sheets of Kevlar, or even 15 sheets, I read on a different website. And
it sounds like a lot of kind of fascinating combination of research and then experimentation, right? So kind of finding how other people have figured out on a really material level, like what actually stops a bullet, right? And then testing it out and seeing kind of what practical applications does this have, particularly for the communities that you're designing this work for, which in many ways are not the communities that, as you point out, the white supremacist websites are concerned with, right? Quite the opposite. So kind of appropriating this technology that is largely only accessible to police, to the state, to the military, and kind of appropriating it to save precisely the communities that those state institutions seem to be increasingly intent on killing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can get a bulletproof vest for like $80. So, I'm really trying to make this much cheaper than that. And yeah, it is definitely a departure for me in that it's not very digitally focused. But I have had a long interest in science and biology, and Ricardo Dominguez and the Particle Group, they talked about this idea of science of the oppressed when they were working on their nanotech research and researching the dangers of nanotechnologies. And I was really inspired by that idea of science of the oppressed, and thinking about how science is so often driven by corporate interests, driven by very big funders, and instead to think about how we could reimagine science in the interest of oppressed and marginalized people. So that instead of just creating weapons, we might be able to create safety and make safety more affordable. Because there's a lot of expensive safety solutions. There's a designer in Bogota, Colombia, who makes really expensive but effective bulletproof couture. So bulletproof jackets that look very nice that you wouldn't even know are bulletproof. And there's certainly a big industry of safety technologies to make rich people safer. But I don't want to contribute to that. I'm trying to do something different.
So this actually kind of dovetails nicely into something I wanted to talk about, which is working in multiple mediums, right? You mentioned your long history of work in digital media art and technology. Here you are working in kind of a combination of fashion design and weapons manufacturing or anti-weapons manufacturing. I don't know if those industries are described differently, but it's a different medium for you. What is that like? Do you find that your kind of previous work and current work in digital technologies, particularly with wearables, do you find that informing your work with Unstoppable and maybe vice versa?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I feel like my work could be framed as conceptual art or post-conceptual art. I mean, so I was trained as an artist at UC San Diego and their MFA program, and there I have a very conceptually based department, and Ricardo Dominguez of Electronic Disturbance Theater was my MFA advisor, and he also works in a very conceptual way. So that means to me that instead of my process being driven by materials, it's really driven by questions. And this kind of ongoing, that's part of why I think about my art process also as like intertwined with my theory, my engagements with theory, like reading and writing, because I don't feel like they're separate. I feel like I have questions that are like partly theoretical and partly very practical, like what material is going to stop this bullet, and a larger question of like how can I make safety for queer and trans people of color something that's affordable, or how can we use technology to enhance the work already being done by movements like the prison abolitionist movement and transformative justice movement to build community-based responses to violence. And so it's really the questions that drive my work. And I've been fascinated by digital media for a long time. And I think I worked in that medium largely because I just had those skills. I did my undergrad degree in computer science. I wanted to be a hacker from a young age. A lot of my life is thanks to the movie Hackers, I have to say.
Nice.
And yeah, I feel like my work is still informed in certain ways by digital media because it's really informed by kind of like open source methodologies of being driven by curiosity. Like, people like the Hackers movie, the cover says their only crime was curiosity. I just rewatched it the other day. People talk about a definition of hacking being something like just the application of curiosity and ingenuity towards technology. So that could be a really broad way of construing hacking. And I think the open source movement's ideas of one, doing it yourself, and two, just making information accessible to people is really shaping Unstoppable. So it's those methods that are a big part of the project, and just trying to have more people realize that they could do things to protect themselves. Like, multiple trans women last year died from knife and stabbing attacks. And I mean, it's not a perfect solution, but if you do something like put a baking sheet in your backpack, you might have some more protection or something to protect yourself with. And that's also like old, not even open source, but just learning from other trans women. You know, like I saw Raina Gossett speaking on a panel at the Insight Conference, and she talked about how Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera used to talk about just put a brick in your purse, and that might help when you need it. So, you know, also just learning from other histories.
Nice. So you mentioned the Electronic Disturbance Theater and Ricardo Dominguez and the kind of work that they've done. And I know that you worked with Ricardo and several of the other members of the team to work on the Transborder Immigrant Tool several years ago. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about what that tool is and what it did?
Yes. So the Transborder Immigrant Tool was a project that was based around the question, could sub $20 phones or less than $20 phones be turned into life-saving devices? And so, you know, this thinking about recycled materials is also very much there in Unstoppable, right? Like, how could we take the materials that are discarded by the auto industry that are causing a lot of environmental destruction and turn them into life-saving devices instead? So with the Transborder Immigrant Tool, it was a kind of a combination of our different interests. And what we did was we made an app for a J2ME app. So at the time it was for really cheap Nextel phones that you could get on eBay for $20 that had a GPS in them. And we mapped out water caches in the U.S.-Mexico border that were put there by humanitarian aid groups like the Border Angels and Water Stations, Inc. And so with this phone app, when you turned on these phones, you would be directed to water, and you would also have the option of hearing poetic sustenance. So our goal was both to reduce the number of deaths from dehydration in the U.S.-Mexico border, but also to try to have this meditation on ways of providing hospitality for people, for migrant people who are commonly just, you know, on the receiving end of a great deal of violence. So the poetry was, there were two sets of poetry, but the one that we intended for the phone that was written by Amy Sarah Carroll was a way of encoding desert survival information. So, like a poem about what does a cactus look like that has drinkable water versus what does a cactus look like that's poisonous, or a poem about how to identify north by the way that certain flowers face.
Nice. I love the invocation of poetic sustenance, right? This kind of, and its combination with material sustenance in the form of water, right? And kind of recognizing that surviving isn't the only thing. There's also thriving, right? That precisely migrants crossing the U.S.-Mexico border, but also migrants more broadly, are often denied. So this kind of interesting combination of conceptualizing art and poetry in this case as necessary for thriving, right? As necessary for surviving, just as much as water, even if it can't replace it, right? And kind of bringing those things together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, Amy cited many times Audre Lorde's poetry is not a luxury, and I absolutely agree.
Nice. So your work in general, both on your current projects and these past projects, is a fantastic example of the kind of richness that happens when you bring art, activism, and academia together in the service of social justice. So why do you work at the intersections of those three mediums? You're a professor, you're a scholar, you're a theorist, obviously you're also an artist and an activist. So why do you bring those different realms together? What does that do for you?
That's a really good question. I mean, I feel lucky to have really found a good kind of role model or mentor in Ricardo Dominguez. And I met him when I was doing mostly like media activism against the war in Iraq. And it seemed like he had figured out how to do art and activism and get paid for it. and work with technology. And those were just all things that I was really passionate about, but I didn't know that I could combine them until really meeting him and seeing his example that these things could be combined. So they were all things that I had been passionate about from a young age. Technology and activism and philosophy and theory. But, I also feel lucky that, so in academia, I also found other examples of doing that, like my dissertation chairs, like Tara McPherson and Kara Keeling. Kara Keeling, I think, also really interestingly combine the study of technology and social justice. And also, part of why I'm at Bothell now is I teach at UW Bothell is because they have a really interdisciplinary program. And so there's really like a broader consensus, or not consensus, but a broader understanding emerging that there's a lot of rich possibility that comes from interdisciplinarity. And, if we could look at older models where these things were not separate, like, I don't know, like Da Vinci, right? But also even older models like Gloria Anzaldúa talks about how for the Nahua people that she identifies with, the indigenous people, the indigenous communities that she identifies with, that for them, art was never separate from the needs of the community and for the needs like healing. And so there's much older traditions where art is just seen naturally as an extension of as responding to community needs. And it's actually more like Western traditions of aesthetics that would separate the observer and separate the artist from social needs and community needs. And so I really identify with those older histories, and I found a lot of inspiration from Gloria Anzaldúa. Also, she's another, like, maybe the biggest example to me of any author that's really inspired my work, because if you just look at Borderlands, her book La Frontera, Borderlands, it's a combination of poetry, of personal history, gender theory, queer theory, immigration studies, and so I just feel lucky that I've had models like her to follow.
That sounds great. So a lot of your work is deeply collaborative, right? Many of the projects you've talked about thus far, as well as some we haven't got a chance to talk about yet. And you have this long history of working in collaboration with different communities, with different individuals, with different organizations. So I'd love to hear more about that process of collaboration. Who are some of your favorite projects or people or communities to collaborate with, and why? And also maybe kind of how have you found the process of collaboration itself? Have you found instances where maybe you're working on projects with people who have a different vision of it than you, or different experiences? And how do those kind of differences shape the collaborative project?
Thanks. I have done a lot of collaboration. I think that it would go back to like open source methodologies or learning from the free software movement. And I definitely participated in the free software movement and in the media justice movement before coming to be an artist. So there was a lot of collaboration there that I learned in the alter globalization movement, just about the power of collectivity. And then a lot of my artistic inspirations were groups and collaborations, like the Electronic Disturbance Theater, who I work with now, but also the Critical Art Ensemble before them, and other groups like even Ubermorgen. So I was inspired by other art groups, or the Yes Man, or RT Mark. There were a lot of art activist groups that really inspired me, or the Sub Rosa Collective, the Cyberfeminist Collective. So collaboration was something that I was inspired by, and I started doing early in my career. I mean, it's often a challenge to be doing that in academia, because academia has been traditionally so focused on individual work and on really making sure you're writing a monograph and publishing things individually. Although I guess that's less true in the sciences. It's more assumed that you would be publishing with the team, but there's still the PI, a principal investigator, or the lead writer on a scientific publications. And so when I started, Electronic Disturbance Theater, I was working with Ricardo at UCSD, so it was kind of a natural collaboration that he asked me if I wanted to work on a project, the Transborder Immigrant Tool, that he was already working on with Brett and Amy. And I worked on that for a few years, but then after that, I wanted to work on a project that was more with communities that I identified with, and more for communities that I identified with. So I started working on local autonomy networks, which was a project about creating mesh-networked clothing and accessories and building community-based responses to violence, starting with wearable electronics as kind of prototypes of networks, and then building from there more low-tech networks like cell phone networks or just even embodied communication. And so with that project, I worked for a few years with different community or based organizations who were working with queer and trans youth of color specifically. And I wanted to do that because it was true at the time, and it's still true, that trans women of color are the #1 target of violence and murder amongst LGBT people. And so it seemed natural to me to focus my energy on collaborating with them, and not to try to bring some outside solution to them, but to actually involve the communities that I'm trying to, provide more safety to, try to involve those communities in the process. Because I think it's an often problematic situation that artists sometimes will come up with a solution for a problem for a community without consulting that community, and then without working with the community to make sure the solution's implemented. And, I tried to do a little better than that with AutoNets. I feel like I could do better, and I'm still going to keep working on AutoNets to keep building out those solutions. And so with Unstoppable, the collaboration, also, as I said before, I see my work as kind of a long theoretical process, or basically a long thought experiment, right? Or a long philosophical process. Like we could think about art and philosophy both as these very long conversations that have happened over many thousands of years, right? And so I think of my own work as a small part in that conversation, and trying to learn from each project and do something different or better the next time. And so with Unstoppable, I was like, okay, actually, among trans women of color, Black trans women are actually the #1 target of violence, more specifically, and that fact is very rarely addressed. So, inspired by Black Lives Matter, I wanted to focus more specifically on Black trans women and working on ways of preventing their murders. And so I was fortunate that Patrice approached me and was like, let's collaborate. So I just responded to that call from the universe and was like, yes, let's do it.
And the results are pretty amazing.
Thanks. Yeah. So we're working on it, and so collaborating with Edzi made sense because she's a Black trans woman and a powerful organizer and artist in LA. And Chris I had worked with previously on Becoming Dragon, and he wrote a lot of the code for Becoming Dragon, which was a previous project of mine. And I knew that he was really into guns. He, for his MFA project, he made a 3D printed gun before those were more common things, and wasn't allowed to bring it on campus. And so I knew that he would have the knowledge to be able to test things safely.
So this actually brings me to my favorite question that I get to ask all of my all the guests on the show. So this podcast is called Imagine Otherwise, and one of the things that I talk with guests about is their version of a better world, that world that they're working towards when they make their art, when they teach their classes, when they publish their books, when they create whatever it is that they create in the world. So I'll ask you, what's the world you're working towards? What do you want?
That's a really great question.
It's big, I know.
It's big. It's big. That's why it's good. Yeah, good question. I would say there's many different levels. So one level of my current work on Unstoppable is just to think about a world where Black trans women can leave the house safely and not have to worry about the likelihood of being murdered. I feel like one of the best things about Unstoppable has been to really make visible and make perceptible that danger that I felt as a trans woman, and that so many trans women feel, and that I imagine that so many Black people must feel, that on a daily basis we have to think about our physical safety. And you know, when you have to spend so much of your day thinking, like, am I going to survive this day? It gives you very little space to imagine the world that you want, or to imagine even what do you want for your own life, because you have to think about if you're going to get to work, or if you're going to get through school and going to get home and survive. So the first level would be that this community of trans women of color could feel safer on a daily basis. And that Black people could feel safer on a daily basis and be less afraid from being murdered by police. Because it's hard to think about safety when the people that are supposed to be keeping you safe are the ones that are endangering your life. But in a larger sense, I see that project as part of a project of prison abolition. And Angela Davis has talked about how if we think about what a world without prisons looks like, that world looks totally different than our world. Because right now, we have this idea that if there's a person who has problematic behavior, we can throw that person away. And that ideology in the U.S. results in millions of people, mostly Black people, being put into a form of contemporary slavery where they are doing unpaid labor in prisons across the U.S. But it also, I think, permeates to our daily lives, where many people interacting with others think that if this person is acting in a way that is problematic for me, I'm going to throw them away. And that might mean murdering them, or it might mean just isolating them and cutting them out of collectives and communities. So I think that working towards a world without prisons really means reimagining our whole social structure. And I also see, so there's many levels to your question, which is part of why I like it, and I think it's good. I also see prison abolition as a small part of a larger project of decolonization. And when I am doing talks in person, I always try to start the talk by acknowledging the original people of the land. And since I'm in Seattle today, in Duwamish territory. I'm not sure which territory you're in, but we live in this condition of colonization, which resulted from the murder of millions of indigenous people. And I think we have a lot of work to go to undo that process. And that is a very big, very long process. In the Americas, it's been 500 years of colonization, so it'll take a long time to undo it. And I think we can think about prisons alongside other institutions of colonization, like schools and universities and museums and the gender binary system and the Western medical system and the whole Western ideology or ontology that we are separate individuals that are separate from each other and separate from nature. And indigenous worldviews and ontologies offer relational ontologies that give us a totally different picture of the universe, where we are connected to nature and our well-being is inseparable from the well-being of nature. And so I also think that world, a decolonized world, is unimaginable to me. So it's hard for me to say what the world I want even looks like, but I can at least give some words to start describing it. And fortunately, a lot of other people are thinking about what that world looks like too.
That's a fantastic answer. And it's exactly what the reason why I started this podcast is to get those voices, those different versions of a different world, a better world, a different sets of worlds. I think of the Zapatista saying, we seek a world in which many worlds are possible.
Yes.
So I love this question, and I love asking people it and kind of collecting people's answers. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. The Zapatistas are definitely part of that project of decolonization and have been a long inspiration of mine. Thank you so much for your questions.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Editing for this episode was done by Julie Leonard. Be sure to check out our website at imagineotherwise.com to listen to full episodes, read show notes, and see links to the people, books, and projects discussed on the show. You can also subscribe to us on iTunes.